It took 6 men to physically pry the President of the United States out of the White House bathtub. 150 kilograms of panic wedged tight against cold porcelain. This was not a comedy. It was the physical breaking point of a man living a nightmare. William Howard Taft never wanted the crown. He was forced onto the throne by his ambitious wife and Theodore Roosevelt. He didn't eat for pleasure. He ate to survive the misery. He didn't just fall asleep in meetings. His throat collapsed, strangling him in front of his staff. The fat man in the tub is not a punchline. He is the wreckage of a gentle soul, ground into dust by the machinery of power. Cincinnati in the mid-19th century was not a place for the idle. They called it the Queen City of the West, but it was a kingdom built on coal, pork, and ambition, a city of grit and smoke where fortunes were forged in the fires of industry. It was a place where a man's worth was measured by his output, his standing, and the rigidity of his spine. At the very apex of this society sat the Taft family, an institution carved from the granite of New England Puritanism and transplanted to the Ohio Valley. They did not just inhabit the city, they loomed over it as the arbiters of morality, the custodians of the law, and the standard bearers of an intellectual rigor that bordered on the sadistic. At the head of this institution was Alphonso Taft, a man who viewed life not as a journey, but as a test that one was required to pass with highest honors. Alphonso Taft was a creature of immense, terrifying competence, a man who believed in the law with the same fervor that religious fanatics believe in God. To him, the law was not just a profession, it was the structure of the universe, the only thing that separated civilization from chaos. He was a man of cold virtue, unyielding, distant, and exacting. In the Taft household, love was conditional, a currency to be earned through achievement, contingent on grades, deportment, and the visible demonstration of excellence. His wife, Louise Torrey Taft, was no less formidable. An intellectual woman of deep reading and high culture, she was nevertheless a prisoner of the Victorian ideal, believing that her children were not merely her offspring, but her contribution to the history of the Republic. She wrote letters that reveal a mind constantly calculating the future status of her brood, constantly worrying that they might fall short of the Taft standard. It was into this high-pressure chamber that William Howard Taft was born on September 15, 1857. From his very first breath, the script was written. Upon his birth, Alphonso wrote a letter to the boy's grandfather, not of love, but of clinical assessment. He wrote about the boy's potential dimensions and his future capacity for work, assessing the newborn like a foal purchased for racing. He has a large head, Alphonso noted, as if measuring a tool. This was the atmosphere, thin, rare, and difficult to breathe, where good enough was considered a failure and mediocrity was a sin. As William grew, a distinct personality began to emerge, one that stood in stark, tragic contrast to the hard edges of his father. William, or Will, was a soft boy, not weak but malleable. He was kind, eager to please, and possessed a natural, bubbling joviality that seemed alien in the dour, serious halls of the Taft residence. Physically, he was already large, known as Big Lub, with a frame meant to carry weight. But the weight he carried wasn't just physical. Beneath the kindness lay the fatal flaw that would eventually destroy him, a psychological trait known as agreeableness. In most people, agreeableness is a virtue that makes for a good neighbor and a loyal friend. But in the world of high-stakes power politics, in the world Alphonso Taft was grooming his son for, extreme agreeableness is a death sentence. Will Taft could not say no. He could not say no to his father, nor to the expectations placed upon him. He absorbed the pressure and internalized the demands. When his father looked at him with those piercing, disappointed eyes, Will didn't rebel or run away. He simply tried harder, working harder and smiling broader. He began to build a persona of the good son, bearing his own desires for peace, quiet, and a life of contemplation deep beneath layers of duty. Most teenagers rebel and define themselves in opposition to their parents. But Will Taft did the opposite. He conformed. He attended Woodward High School and later, inevitably, Yale University, because for a Taft, going anywhere else would have been a form of heresy. At Yale, the tragedy deepened, disguised as triumph. William Howard Taft was a man of immense intellect, graduating second in his class in 1878. To anyone else, this was a crowning achievement, but to Alphonso Taft, it was merely the minimum payment on the debt of being born a Taft. Diaries from this time reveal the strain. A young man constantly anxious, constantly worried about slipping. He wasn't driven by ambition. He was driven by the fear of disappointment, running a race he didn't want to run, sprinting just to keep the wolves of criticism at bay. He was popular, the big man on campus in both the literal and figurative sense, a member of Skull and Bones, surrounded by the elite. But while they dreamed of conquest, Will dreamed of stability. He didn't want to conquer the world. He wanted to understand it through the logic of the law. This is the central conflict of his early life. To Will Taft, the law was a sanctuary. In a courtroom, there were rules, precedents, a right answer, and a wrong answer. It was a world that made sense, unlike the chaotic, sharp-elbowed world of politics. He fell in love with the judiciary, seeing the judge not as a king, but as a monk, a servant of a higher truth, insulated from the messy passions of the mob. He wanted to be a judge. That was his noble, quiet, respectable dream. But a Taft? A judge? Perhaps as a stepping stone, but to stop there, to settle for the quiet dignity of the bench when the Senate or the White House loomed in the distance, was not the plan. Alfonso saw his son's judicial temperament not as a calling, but as a tool to be sharpened and weaponized for political gain. Young Will, the pleaser, the gentle giant, nodded his head. He studied the law not just to practice it, but to use it as a ladder. By 1880, at the age of 23, he graduated from Cincinnati Law School and was admitted to the Ohio bar. He was a full-grown man now, standing nearly 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered with a mustache that would become his trademark. He looked like a titan, a man who could move mountains. But inside that massive chest beat the heart of a man who just wanted to be liked, a man terrified of conflict, a man who was already learning to use food as a sedative. The early signs of a deadly relationship began to form. Food was no longer just sustenance. In the Victorian era, a large man was seen as prosperous. But for Taft, eating was beginning to take on a different function. It was a coping mechanism. When the pressure from Alfonso became too great, when the anxiety of a court case kept him awake, he ate. He ate to fill the emptiness where his own agency should have been, to weigh himself down, perhaps to make himself immovable in a world that was constantly trying to push him forward. He was a man building his own prison, brick by brick, calorie by calorie. As he stepped into his professional life in the 1880s, the trap was set. He had the pedigree, the intellect, and the size. The world looked at William Howard Taft and saw a leader, a bulldozer. They didn't see that the bulldozer had no driver, or rather, that the driver's seat was empty, waiting for someone else to climb in and take the wheel. If Alfonso Taft built the cage, it was about to be Helen Herron or Nellie, who would lock the door and throw away the key. We leave young Will Taft standing on the precipice of his career, a brilliant, anxious giant, desperate to be good, desperate to be loved, and utterly unaware that his desire to please would be the instrument of his torture. The tragedy of William Howard Taft is not that he was a bad man. It is that he was too good a man for the bad business of power, and the world was about to teach him that kindness in the arena of history is not a virtue. It is a fatal vulnerability. If Alphonso Taft constructed the cage of expectation, it was Helen Herron who walked inside, took the measurements, and decided it was too small. Their union was not merely a marriage, it was a collision of opposing physics. On one side was Will, massive, immovable, content, seeking the quiet equilibrium of the law. On the other was Nellie, sharp, kinetic, hungry, a woman who looked at the horizon and saw only territory to be conquered. Their meeting in Cincinnati in the late 1870s was the inciting incident of the drama proper, the moment the fuse was lit on a bomb that would take 30 years to explode. Helen Herron was not a villain, though history often casts ambitious women in that role. She was rather a victim of her own time, a brilliant strategic mind trapped in a society that denied women the vote, let alone the presidency. She was the daughter of a judge, but she did not want to interpret the law. She wanted to make history. At 17, she had visited the White House as a guest of President Rutherford B. Hayes. She later wrote that she resolved then and there to return, not as a guest, but as the mistress of the house. When she met Will Taft at a sledding party, a scene of innocent, snowy Americana, she did not just see a charming, heavy-set lawyer. She saw a vessel. She saw a man with the pedigree and the intellect to carry her ambitions across the threshold she could not cross herself. They married in 1886. The dynamic was established almost immediately. Will adored her. He was terrified of losing her affection, and she wielded that affection like a master conducting an orchestra. She pushed him. When he was content with a minor local judgeship, she whispered of Washington. When he spoke of the tranquility of the bench, she spoke of the glory of the executive. There is a heartbreaking intimacy to this phase of his life. We see a man who is fundamentally happy with simple things: a good meal, a complex legal brief, a laugh with friends, being slowly, methodically steered away from his nature. He called her the great ruler. He meant it as a term of endearment, but in the forensic light of history, it reads like a confession of his own surrender. Despite the domestic pressure, the years between 1887 and 1890 were arguably the happiest of his professional life. He was appointed to the Superior Court of Cincinnati. Finally, he was where he belonged, a judge. Visceral imagery from this period shows a man in his element. On the bench, Taft was not the anxious pleaser. He was the sovereign. He was calm. He was decisive. The law was a binary world of order, free from the messy gray compromises of politics. He sat high above the fray, his growing bulk acting as an anchor. He was fair, respected, and deeply, profoundly satisfied. Had he been left there, he might have lived a long, healthy life, a footnote in Ohio history, but a happy man. But happiness in the Taft narrative was always a precursor to disruption. In 1890, the call came from Washington. President Benjamin Harrison wanted him as Solicitor General. It was a prestigious post. The lawyer for the government, the man who argues before the Supreme Court. Will hesitated. He didn't want to leave his bench, but the great ruler had her eyes on the Capitol. They moved, and here the tragedy began to accelerate. As Solicitor General, Taft was brilliant. He won 15 of the 18 cases he argued, but the physical cost began to mount. Here, the physical toll became visible. The stress of Washington, the social climbing required by Nellie, the sheer relentless pace of the federal government, It all triggered a primitive coping mechanism. The meals grew larger. The waistline expanded. He was eating his anxiety, swallowing his reluctance with every bite of steak and potato. Yet even then, fate offered him an escape hatch. In 1892, he was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He could return to Cincinnati. He could return to the bench. For the next 8 years, from 1892 to 1900, Taft lived in a kind of golden twilight before the dark night of his presidency. He loved this job. He later said these were the most pleasant years of his life. He was a federal judge, powerful but removed from the grime of elections. He traveled the circuit, wrote learned opinions, and spent his evenings reading. He was the man he wanted to be. But the fatal flaw, his inability to disappoint those he loved, was festering. During these years, the specter of the Supreme Court arose. It was the only job he truly coveted. But every time the possibility was raised, Nellie would grow cold. She did not want to be the wife of a Chief Justice. That was a life of quiet dignity. She wanted the noise and the thunder of the White House. She famously told him that the judiciary was a fixed groove, a place where ambitious men went to die. She wanted him in the arena. And Will, looking at the woman he loved, looking at the disappointment in her eyes, learned to suppress his own dream. He learned to apologize for wanting the one thing that brought him peace. The psychological toll of this dissonance, living a life that felt right while being told it was wrong, cannot be overstated. It created a permanent fissure in his psyche. He began to view his own desires as lazy, as lacking in grit. He began to view his ambition for the court as a moral failing, a sign that he wasn't man enough for the rough and tumble of politics. This is the tragic irony. His sanity was framed as weakness, and his destruction was framed as duty. As the century turned, the year 1900 approached like a storm front. The Spanish-American War had ended, and the United States found itself in possession of an empire. The Philippines, a sprawling archipelago on the other side of the world, needed a governor. President William McKinley needed a man of immense intellect and administrative skill to tame the new colony. He didn't want a soldier, he wanted a judge. The phone rang in the Taft household. It was the call that would end his happiness forever. Will didn't want to go. He hated the heat. He hated the idea of leaving his beloved court. He hated the concept of imperialism. But McKinley pressed. The Republican Party pressed. And inevitably, Nellie saw the stepping stone she had been waiting for. To go to the Philippines was to become a viceroy, a king in all but name. It was the path to the presidency. By 1900, the trap had snapped shut. Standing on a train platform, looking back at the life he was leaving behind, Taft was 42 years old. He was heavy, yes, but he was still healthy. He was a respected judge. As he boarded the train west, bound for a ship that would take him to the tropics, he was walking away from his identity and toward his doom. The great ruler was smiling. The big lub was not. If Cincinnati was a cage of expectation, the Philippines was a kiln. William Howard Taft arrived in Manila in June 1900, a man of Northern Constitution stepping into a tropical furnace. The environment was not merely passive, it was predatory. He was a man of significant mass, over 300 pounds by now, wrapped in the stifling wool and linen suits of the era, attempting to govern an archipelago seething with insurrection and baking under an equatorial sun. The heat was not merely a weather condition, it was an active antagonist. It sapped his will, inflamed his skin, and swelled his limbs. He was a melting giant in a land of fire. Yet here we encounter the profound paradox of Taft's life. the element that makes his story so maddeningly tragic. He was excellent at the job he hated. As Governor General, he was not the imperial tyrant the Filipinos feared. He was, shockingly, a humanist. He called the Filipinos his little brown brothers, a phrase that reeks of Victorian paternalism to modern ears, but at the time was a radical declaration of affection in the face of a brutal American military occupation. He built roads, established a judicial system, and negotiated with the Vatican to buy friar lands. He gave himself entirely to the task, working 16-hour days, sweating through suit after suit, driven by that compulsive need to be good, to be worthy of the trust placed in him. But the body keeps the score. The stress of governing a colony, combined with the oppressive climate, triggered a catastrophic physical decline. He contracted dysentery. He developed a rectal abscess that required surgery. There were days he could not walk, days he lay in bed, a mountain of feverish flesh, delirious with pain. And what was the cure? Food, comfort. The cycle of stress eating accelerated. He was consuming the colony's rich, starchy diet to numb the agony of his own existence, literally expanding to fill the void of his unhappiness. And then the devil came to the crossroads. In 1902, a seat opened on the U.S. Supreme Court. This was it, the escape hatch, the golden ticket. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had ascended to the presidency after McKinley's assassination, offered the spot to Taft. It was everything Will had ever wanted. He could leave the hell of the tropics, leave the treacherous world of politics, and go home to the quiet, air-conditioned dignity of the bench. He wrote to his brother, practically vibrating with hope. He was ready to say yes. But the great ruler intervened. Nellie Taft did not want to be the wife of a justice. She wanted to be the First Lady. She argued that leaving the Philippines now would be a dereliction of duty, a betrayal of the people he had promised to protect. And then the cruelest twist. The Filipinos themselves staged demonstrations begging Big Taft to stay. Caught between his dream and his conscience, Taft folded. He declined the offer. A few months later, another seat opened. Roosevelt offered it again. Taft declined again. It was a moment of profound pathology. A man trapped in a physical hell offered salvation twice, refused it because he could not bear to let others down. It was the fatal flaw of agreeableness weaponized against the self. He stayed in the oven for another year, cooking himself alive for a cause he didn't truly believe in, simply because he could not say the word no. In 1904, Roosevelt summoned him back to Washington, not to be a judge, but to be Secretary of War. The title was a misnomer. Taft was not a warrior. He was Roosevelt's fixer, the Secretary of everything. While Roosevelt, the manic, toothy, spectacle-wearing ball of energy, preened for the cameras and made grand pronouncements, it was Taft who sat in the back rooms, doing the heavy lifting. He oversaw the construction of the Panama Canal, pacified Cuba, and toured the world. The dynamic between Roosevelt and Taft during these years is the emotional core of the tragedy. Roosevelt loved Taft, but he loved him like a man loves a useful tool or a loyal golden retriever. He called him Will, dear old Will. He leaned on Taft's legal mind to ground his own impulsive flightiness, but he never respected Taft's autonomy. He saw Taft not as a separate entity, but as an extension of his own will. And Taft, starving for approval, lapped it up, basking in Roosevelt's glow, unaware that he was being groomed for a sacrifice. By 1908, the trap was fully laid. Roosevelt had promised not to run for a third term, but he couldn't bear to leave the White House to just anyone. He needed a proxy. He needed someone who would keep the seat warm, who would continue his policies without overshadowing his legacy. He looked at the loyal, pliable, exhausted William Howard Taft, and he saw his man. Taft resisted. He told anyone who would listen that he hated politics. He told a reporter, "Politics, when I am in it, makes me sick." He meant it literally. The very thought of campaigning made him nauseous. His mother, Louise, now dying, wrote a prophetic letter. "I do not want my son to be president. His is a judicial mind and he loves the law." Even his mother saw the mismatch. But Nellie saw the prize, and Roosevelt saw the necessity. The campaign of 1908 was a forced march. Taft was pushed onto trains, shoved onto stages, told to smile, told to wave. He was a bad campaigner, awkward and visibly exhausted, often falling asleep in between stops. He was a man performing a role he hadn't rehearsed for a play he didn't want to be in. Yet the machine was too strong. The Roosevelt popularity was a tidal wave that carried Taft, gasping for air all the way to the shore. He won. But as he looked at the election returns, William Howard Taft didn't feel the thrill of victory. He felt the heavy, cold dread of a prisoner hearing the cell door slam shut. He had finally achieved the highest office in the land, the dream of millions, the pinnacle of American life, and all he wanted to do was weep. The presidency wasn't a prize, it was the final, inescapable cage, and he was now officially the loneliest man in the world. March 4th, 1909 began with a blizzard. It was the worst inaugural weather in decades. Trains were stalled, telegraph lines were down, and the streets of Washington were choked with ice. As William Howard Taft stood on the platform to take the oath of office, the wind whipped his face stinging and cold. He later joked with that self-deprecating humor that was his shield that he knew it would be a cold day when he became president. But nature was not joking. It was setting the stage. The elements themselves seemed to be rejecting his ascension. If the years leading up to the presidency were a slow march toward the cliff, the presidency itself was the fall. Taft entered the White House not as a conqueror, but as a man fulfilling a sentence, and almost immediately the few supports he had began to crumble. Just 2 months into his term, his wife Nellie, the architect of his rise, the great ruler who had steered him to this moment, suffered a catastrophic stroke. She lost her speech. She lost her mobility. The voice that had driven him, the will that had sustained him, was suddenly silenced. Taft was now truly alone. He was left in the lonesomest place in the world, caring for an invalid wife while trying to steer a nation that expected him to be Theodore Roosevelt. And he tried. God, how he tried. He threw himself into the work with a desperate, flailing energy. He broke up the Standard Oil monopoly. He fought for the federal income tax. He established the postal savings system. On paper, his record is that of a successful progressive reformer. But history is not written on paper. It is written in perception. And the perception was that Taft was failing. He lacked Roosevelt's magic. Where Teddy governed by poetry and thunder, Taft governed by prose and precedent. He revered the Constitution too much to bend it, and in a time of revolutionary fervor, his caution looked like cowardice. The public, addicted to Roosevelt's adrenaline, found Taft boring. They found him plodding. And as the criticism mounted, so did the weight. It is here, in the sanctuary of the White House, that the tragedy of his body reached its grotesque crescendo. He ballooned to over 350 pounds. The famous story of the bathtub, the custom-made tub large enough to hold 4 men, is not a funny anecdote. It is a testament to his suffering. Imagine the humiliation of a man, the leader of the free world, needing a team of engineers to design a vessel simply so he could wash himself without getting wedged between the porcelain walls. The visceral reality of his daily life was a nightmare of suffocation. He suffered from severe sleep apnea, a condition unknown to doctors of the time. At night, his throat would close, strangling him, jerking him awake hundreds of times. He was never truly rested. During the day, the deprivation took its toll. He would fall asleep in cabinet meetings. He fell asleep while signing documents. He once fell asleep in a car while the Speaker of the House was talking to him. The press mocked him as lazy. They drew cartoons of a sleeping giant. They didn't know they were mocking a man who was slowly dying of oxygen deprivation, a man whose body was collapsing under the stress of a job he never wanted. But the cruelest blow came not from his body, but from his best friend. By 1910, Theodore Roosevelt had returned from his safari in Africa. He expected to find Taft keeping the seat warm, ruling as a faithful regent. Instead, he found a man who had his own mind, a man who respected the law more than he respected Roosevelt's ego. The friendship, once the warmest in Washington, turned into ice. Roosevelt began to attack Taft publicly. He called him a puzzle wit. He called him a fathead. The psychological impact on Taft was devastating. He loved Roosevelt. He worshipped him. To be rejected by his idol broke something inside him that politics could never repair. A reporter once found Taft in the Oval Office after a brutal attack from Roosevelt, his head in his hands, weeping uncontrollably, crying out, "Roosevelt was my closest friend." It is a scene of Shakespearean pathos, the king weeping not for his crown, but for the loss of his brother. The election of 1912 remains the most brutal political slaughter in American history. Roosevelt denied the Republican nomination, ran against Taft as a third-party candidate for the Bull Moose Party. He tore the Republican vote in half. He burned the House down rather than let Taft run it. Taft knew he would lose. He stopped campaigning. He resigned himself to the execution. In the final months, he wasn't running for re-election. He was running for his dignity. He gave speeches not to win votes, but to defend the Constitution against what he saw as Roosevelt's demagoguery. For the first time in his life, William Howard Taft stopped trying to please. He stood his ground. He fought back. The result was a massacre. Taft won only 2 states, Utah and Vermont. He received just 8 electoral votes to Woodrow Wilson's 435 and Roosevelt's 88. It was the worst defeat for an incumbent president in history, a total abject repudiation. But as the returns came in on that November night in 1912, a strange thing happened. The staff at the White House expected gloom. They expected tears. Instead, they heard laughter. William Howard Taft was smiling. He was cracking jokes. He told a friend, "I have been elected ex-president of the United States." For the first time in 4 years, perhaps for the first time in 30 years, the wait was gone. The cage door was open. The voters, in their rejection, had given him the greatest gift imaginable, his freedom. He had survived the fire. He was battered, he was bruised, and his heart was broken by the betrayal of a friend, but he was free. The big lub was no longer the property of the American people. He belonged to himself again. As he packed his bags to leave the White House in March 1913, he looked like a man who had just been acquitted of a crime. He left behind the bathtub, the stress, and the impossible expectations. He walked out into the cool spring air, a loser in the eyes of history, but a survivor in the eyes of truth. The tragedy of the presidency was over. The redemption of the man was about to begin. When William Howard Taft boarded the train out of Washington, D.C. in March 1913, he was leaving behind a wreckage. His party was split, his friendship with Theodore Roosevelt was ashes, and his reputation was tattered. By all conventional metrics of political history, he was a failure, a man chewed up and spat out by the machinery of power. But if you look at the photographs taken in the months immediately following his departure, you do not see a broken man. You see a man who has just been allowed to breathe for the first time in 4 years. He retreated to New Haven, Connecticut, to his alma mater, Yale University. to teach law. It was a return to the womb, a return to the only intellectual home he had ever truly known. And it was here, in the quiet, dusty halls of academia, that the most stunning physical transformation of his life took place. The big lub, the man who had required a custom-built bathtub, began to shrink. Without the crushing cortisol of the presidency, without the daily humiliation of political attacks, and without the need to armor himself against a hostile world, the weight simply fell off. Within a year, he lost 70 pounds. He stopped the compulsive eating. He began to walk the streets of New Haven waving to students, a twinkle returning to his eye. He wrote to a friend that he had sloughed off the presidency like a snake sheds a dead skin. The sleep apnea vanished. The mental fog lifted. The detective of history must note this correlation. His obesity was not a lack of discipline. It was a physical manifestation of his misery. Once the misery was removed, the body healed. He spent these years in a kind of joyous exile. He was popular with the students, known for his infectious laugh, a laugh that was described as a seismic event, starting in his belly and rolling outward until it shook the room. He was finally doing what he had wanted to do in 1880. He was thinking about the law. He wasn't enforcing it or weaponizing it. He was teaching it. He was shaping the next generation of minds, preaching the gospel of the Constitution not as a political tool, but as a sacred covenant. But the world was not done with him yet. As World War I engulfed the globe, Taft was called back to service not as a politician, but as a mediator. He served on the National War Labor Board, tasked with preventing strikes that could cripple the war effort. Here, we see the true character of the man emerge, free from Roosevelt's shadow. He was surprisingly pro-labor. The conservative judge surprised everyone by consistently ruling that workers had a right to organize, a right to a living wage. He wasn't playing to a base, he was simply looking at the evidence and deciding what was fair. It was a glimpse of the great Chief Justice he was yet to become. During this period, a final poignant curtain fell on the tragedy of his friendship with Roosevelt. In 1918, the two men crossed paths in the dining room of a hotel in Chicago. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone watched. Would they fight? Would they ignore each other? Instead, they shook hands. They exchanged a few polite words. It was not a reconciliation. The wounds were too deep, the betrayal too raw, but it was a truce. When Roosevelt died a year later in 1919, Taft wept. He served as an honorary pallbearer, standing in the snow at the grave of the man who had made him and then tried to destroy him. With Roosevelt gone, the last ghost of his past was laid to rest. Taft was now completely his own man. And then, in 1921, the telephone rang. It was the new president, Warren G. Harding. Harding was a man of many flaws, but he possessed one singular virtue. He knew that William Howard Taft belonged on the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, Edward Douglas White, had died. The seat, the center chair, the throne of the American judiciary was empty. For 30 years, Taft had circled this chair. He had denied it to please his father. He had denied it to please his wife. He had denied it to serve Roosevelt. He had denied it to serve the Philippines. He had sacrificed his happiness, his health, and his reputation, all while looking wistfully at a prize he thought he would never touch. When Harding offered him the Chief Justiceship, Taft didn't hesitate. He didn't ask Nellie. He didn't weigh the political consequences. He said yes. On July 11, 1921, William Howard Taft took the oath of office. He remains the only person in American history to have served as both President and Chief Justice. But looking at the footage of that day, the difference is heartbreakingly clear. At his presidential inauguration, he looked like a man marching to the gallows. At his judicial swearing in, He looked like a man coming home. He was 63 years old. He was scarred. He was older, but he was finally, after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness of other people's expectations, exactly where he was supposed to be. The tragedy was over. The legacy was about to be written. If the presidency was a prison sentence served in the glaring, unforgiving light of public scrutiny, the Supreme Court was the mountaintop monastery where William Howard Taft finally found his God. The profound psychological shift of 1921 was visible in the man who walked into the swearing-in ceremony. He was 63 years old. His hair was white. The trademark mustache, once a symbol of vigor, was now a badge of elder statesmanship. But the eyes, often described during his White House years as watery, tired, or fearful, were suddenly clear. For 30 years, Taft had been a wanderer in the wilderness of other people's ambitions. He had been a reluctant colonial governor, a reluctant cabinet member, and a reluctant president. But when he took the oath as the 10th Chief Justice of the United States on July 11th, 1921, he was for the first time in his adult life exactly where he wanted to be. The transformation was immediate and visceral. He wrote to a friend shortly after his appointment with a clarity that borders on the chilling, "I don't remember that I ever was president." We must pause and weigh the gravity of that sentence. It is not merely a figure of speech. It is a psychological amputation. Taft was actively severing the limb of his past to save the body of his present. He viewed his 4 years in the White House not as the pinnacle of his career, but as a traumatic interruption, a fever dream of incompetence and humiliation that he wished to expunge from the record. In his mind, the presidency was a deviation. The court was the destiny. When Taft arrived at the Supreme Court, he did not find a temple, he found a basement. In 1921, the highest court in the land was a squatter, operating out of the old Senate chamber in the Capitol building. It was a dark, cramped, humid space that smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the dust of a century. The justices had no private offices. They worked from their homes. The docket was a disaster clogged with thousands of trivial cases, patent disputes, minor jurisdictional arguments, the flotsam and jetsam of federal law that paralyzed the system. Justice was not just blind, it was suffocating under its own weight. It took years for a case to be heard. The machinery of American law was rusted shut. This is where the big lub, the man mocked as lazy and lethargic by the press of 1910, revealed his true nature. He was not lazy, he had simply been miscast. Put a fish on a bicycle, and it looks clumsy. Put it in water, and it becomes a torpedo. Taft was back in the water. He attacked the inefficiency of the court with a ferocity that stunned his colleagues. He didn't just interpret the law, he rebuilt the engine. He launched a crusade to modernize the federal judiciary, lobbying Congress with a political savvy he had never shown as president. He used his connections, his charm, and his sheer physical presence to push through the Judiciary Act of 1925, known as the Judges' Bill. This piece of legislation is the boring technical detail that contains the secret to his greatness. Before this act, the Supreme Court had to hear almost every case appealed to it. They were drowning in minutia. Taft's bill gave the court the power of certiorari, the power to choose which cases mattered. He transformed the Supreme Court from a dumping ground for legal grievances into a sniper's nest of constitutional interpretation. He gave the court the power to say no. It is a profound irony that the man who could never say no in his personal life saved the American legal system by granting it the power of refusal. But his vision went beyond procedure. He wanted a monument. He believed that the law was the third pillar of the American Trinity, equal to the Congress and the President, and yet it was homeless. He looked at the cramped basement in the Capitol and felt a deep, abiding shame. He envisioned a temple, a white marble fortress that would stand apart from the noise of politics, a physical manifestation of the law's permanence. He selected the architect, Cass Gilbert. He fought for the funding. He pored over the blueprints. The Supreme Court building that stands in Washington, D.C. today, that imposing silent cathedral of justice, is William Howard Taft's body in stone. He never saw it finished, but he laid every metaphorical brick. Inside this temple of law, Taft presided as a benevolent patriarch. The atmosphere of the Taft court was markedly different from the fractious, toxic environment of his cabinet. He massaged the other justices. He brought them together. He instituted a rule that they would all shake hands before every conference, a ritual that continues to this day, designed to remind them that they were brothers-in-law, even if they were enemies in opinion. He managed the brilliant but fiery personalities of men like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and Louis Brandeis with a grace that bordered on the artistic. Holmes, the great skeptic, adored Taft. Brandeis, the fiery progressive, respected him. Taft wasn't the deepest legal scholar on the bench. He left the poetic philosophy to Holmes, but he was the glue. He was the chief in every sense of the word. Visceral imagery from this decade shows a man who has reclaimed his body. He walked 3 miles a day. He monitored his diet. The 350-pound giant of 1910 slimmed down to a manageable, albeit still large, size. But while the spirit was willing, the machinery was wearing out. The tragedy of this period is not one of failure, but of time. He had found his paradise too late. The years of obesity, the years of untreated sleep apnea, the years of cortisol flooding his system during the presidency, they had done their silent, irreversible work on his heart. By the late 1920s, the dark nostalgia of his life began to creep back in, not as depression, but as decay. The letters from this period change tone. They become urgency mixed with resignation. He watched his generation die. He watched his brother Charles die. He watched Roosevelt die. He was the last of the Victorian titans, a man of the 19th century trying to hold back the chaotic tides of the 20th. He loathed the Jazz Age. He loathed the prohibition he was forced to enforce. He saw the world becoming faster, louder, and less respectful of the order he cherished. He clung to the bench with a desperate white-knuckled grip. He was terrified of retiring. To retire was to die. The court was his life support system. The intellectual rigor kept his blood pumping. He wrote to his son that he would stay on the court to keep the Bolsheviks out, a joke that masked a deeper fear, the fear of irrelevance. He pushed himself beyond the limits of human endurance. He wrote opinions while lying in bed, gasping for air. He dictated memos while his heart fluttered and stalled. He was a captain who refused to leave the bridge, even as the ship began to list. The end of the 1920s brought a slow, grinding decline. The big lub was shrinking again, but this time not from health, but from wasting. His face grew gaunt. The jovial smile was replaced by the grimace of chronic pain. His heart, enlarged and weakened by decades of carrying too much weight, was failing. The circulation in his legs faltered. The simple act of climbing the steps to the bench became a Herculean trial. Observers in the courtroom noticed that the Chief Justice would sometimes close his eyes for long periods, not in sleep, but in a deep meditative attempt to gather enough energy to continue. In early 1930, the inevitable arrived. He could no longer leave his house. The mind, that brilliant, orderly archive of statutes and precedents, began to fog. He hallucinated. He forgot names. The realization that he had to resign broke him. It was a second death. To leave the presidency was a liberation. To leave the court was an execution. On February 3, 1930, he sent his resignation letter to President Herbert Hoover. He didn't type it. He couldn't. He signed it with a shaking hand, the signature trailing off like a dying heartbeat. The silence that descended on his home on Wyoming Avenue was heavy. He lay in his bed, a man who had held the two most powerful offices in the greatest nation on earth, reduced to a single room. He was no longer the president. He was no longer the chief justice. He was just Will. The accolades poured in from across the nation, editorials praising his service, letters from the justices weeping at his departure, but he was too far gone to read them. The tragedy of the final chapter is that he died wondering if he had done enough. He died wondering if the fatal flaw, the desire to please, the inability to say no, had wasted his life. He had spent 72 years carrying the weight of the world, and in the end, he had to set it down alone. The temple of law was built, but its high priest was dying at the gates. To see the real William Howard Taft, we must step away from the marble columns of the Supreme Court and the velvet ropes of the White House. We must enter the private, dimly lit chambers of his own body. His career was a tragedy of circumstance, but the true battlefield was his flesh. History has been content to weigh him on a scale, recording the number 350 with a smirk, but it has rarely bothered to take his pulse. The forensic truth is simple. He was not a glutton. He was a man engaged in a lifelong desperate act of self-medication. The obesity of William Howard Taft was not a lifestyle choice. It was a fortress built to protect a soft heart from a hard world. The forensic evidence of his suffering lies in the medical records. In the early 20th century, medicine had no name for what was killing him. They called him Pickwickian, a reference to a sleepy character in Dickens. Today we know he was suffering from a catastrophic case of obstructive sleep apnea. This is the visceral reality of his nights. The President of the United States would lie down in his bed, the weight of his neck collapsing his windpipe. For minutes at a time, he would not breathe. He would suffocate in his sleep, his body thrashing in a panic he was not conscious of, until he gasped awake, starving for air, only to drift back into the same drowning cycle. Imagine the psychological torture of never truly sleeping. Imagine the fog that enveloped his brain. When he fell asleep in meetings with the Speaker of the House or dozed off during a funeral procession, it was not laziness. It was a brain shutting down to preserve its basic functions. He was a man walking through an underwater dreamscape, trying to govern a nation while his own biology was trying to strangle him. The press mocked him as the sleeping beauty. The reality was a waking nightmare of exhaustion. And how did he treat this exhaustion? He ate. The humor must be stripped from the image of his appetite. This was not the joy of a gourmand. It was the compulsion of an addict. Food was the only reliable source of dopamine in a life defined by duty. When Roosevelt attacked him, he ate. When Nellie pushed him, he ate. The White House staff recorded breakfasts of 12-ounce steaks, sugary pastries, and mountains of potatoes. This was stress eating on an industrial scale. He was building a physical barrier between himself and the demands of his office. The fat was armor. If he was big enough, perhaps he could not be moved. If he was heavy enough, perhaps he could anchor himself against the winds of change that were blowing him toward cliffs he did not wish to jump from. Then came the incident that history reduced to a punchline, but which was, in reality, a scene of Gothic horror. Sometime early in his presidency, Taft lowered his massive frame into the standard White House tub and found he could not move. The physics of the situation are terrifying. A naked, vulnerable human being wedged tight against cold porcelain, the water rising, the leverage gone. He had to call for help. He had to be physically pried loose by his own servants. Consider the humiliation. For a man of Taft's Victorian dignity, a man who prided himself on decorum, this was the ultimate betrayal of the self. His body had become a prison cell that he carried with him everywhere. The installation of the famous custom-made tub, large enough to hold 4 men, was not an act of luxury. It was an admission of defeat. It was a monument to his entrapment. Photographs of the workers sitting in that tub before it was installed are often used to elicit a chuckle. Look closer. It looks like a coffin. But the physical pain was secondary to the emotional architecture of his marriage. We return to Helen Nellie, Heron Taft. To cast her as the villain is too simple, but to ignore her role is negligent. She was the fatal flaw externalized. Nellie loved Will, but she loved the idea of Will more. She saw the potential for greatness that he did not see in himself. When she suffered her stroke in May 1909, just 2 months into his presidency, the dynamic shifted from pressure to guilt. Taft spent his presidency sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, teaching her to speak again. The great ruler was silenced, and in her silence, her expectations loomed even larger. He couldn't quit. He couldn't fail. He had to succeed for her because she could no longer do it for herself. He was carrying the weight of her shattered ambition on his back, adding it to the physical weight that was already crushing his knees. There is a profound sadness in the letters from this period. He writes of her with a tenderness that is heartbreaking, describing her progress, her moods, her small victories. He was a nursemaid to the one who had forced him into the fire. He loved her too much to blame her, so he blamed himself. He internalized the failure. And yet through all of this, the suffocation, the humiliation, the guilt, he smiled. This is the final layer of the tragedy, the Taft chuckle. It was his weapon and his shield. He learned early that a fat man is allowed to be funny, but he is not allowed to be tragic. If he laughed at himself first, he robbed the world of the chance to hurt him. He turned his pain into a performance. He became the jolly giant because the alternative was to be the weeping monster. He joked about his weight constantly. He once telegraphed Elihu Root after a long horse ride, rode 25 miles today, feeling fine. Root telegraphed back, "How is the horse?" Taft told that story for the rest of his life. He laughed the loudest. But the detective of history must ask, what kind of pain does a man have to be in to make his own suffering the centerpiece of his social identity? It was a deflection. "Look at the fat man laugh," he seemed to say, "so you don't look at the sad man crying." In the quiet hours of the night when the guests had gone and the applause had faded, William Howard Taft was left alone with the body that had betrayed him and the mind that trapped him. He was a man of immense capacity for love. He loved his children. He loved the law. He loved his country. But he seemed incapable of loving himself enough to say stop. He sacrificed his health on the altar of agreeableness. He allowed himself to be consumed bite by bite, request by request, until the man who wanted to be a judge was almost completely swallowed by the man who had to be president. This was not a life of indulgence. It was a life of endurance. Every step he took carrying those 350 pounds was a feat of strength. Every speech he gave while starving for oxygen was an act of will. Beneath the layers of flesh lived a stoic philosopher, a man who understood that his role was to bear the burden that others refused to carry. He was the Atlas of the Gilded Age, holding up a world he didn't want, and the only thing that buckled was his own heart. On March 8, 1930, a profound silence descended upon Washington, D.C. A blizzard was raging outside, coating the Capitol in a shroud of white, a haunting echo of the blizzard that had greeted his inauguration 21 years earlier. But inside the house on Wyoming Avenue, the storm was over. William Howard Taft, the man who had been the largest figure in American life, both literally and figuratively, had simply ceased to be. He died at 5:15 p.m. The official cause was heart disease, inflammation of the bladder, and high blood pressure. But the forensic truth is far simpler. He died of exhaustion. He had carried the expectations of a father, a wife, a president, and a nation for 72 years. The machinery, built to withstand immense pressure, had finally ground to a halt. He slipped away not with a roar, but with a quiet sigh, holding the hand of the one who had pushed him to the heights, Nellie. In that final moment, the ambition, the friction, and the noise of their lives dissolved. There was just a husband and a wife, alone at the end of the road. The funeral was a moment of supreme historical symbolism. Taft was not taken back to Ohio. He was not buried in a family plot. He was taken to Arlington National Cemetery. He was the first president and the first chief justice to be interred in that hallowed ground. The visual weight of this choice was crushing. Arlington is a place for soldiers. It is a place for men who died following orders. It is fitting that Taft lies there. He was never a soldier in uniform, but he was a casualty of duty. He had marched when he was told to march. He had fought battles he did not choose. He had taken the arrows meant for others. As the bugle played taps over his grave, the notes drifting over the Potomac, it was a salute to a man who had given his life to the state, piece by piece, pound by pound. As the earth settles over his grave, the final verdict on the life of William Howard Taft begins to form. History has not been kind to him. Open a textbook, browse a website, and you will find the caricature, the fat man, the bathtub, the man who got stuck. We use him as a benchmark for obesity, a trivia question, a punchline. This is our collective crime. We have reduced a Greek tragedy to a slapstick comedy. To judge him by his waistline is to miss the grandeur of his suffering. William Howard Taft was a man of supreme competence who was cursed with a fatal flaw. He was too good for the game he was forced to play. His hamartia, his tragic error, was his inability to disappoint those he loved. He was a man of peace thrown into a pit of vipers. He was a judicial monk forced to wear the emperor's clothes. Look at what he achieved despite his misery. He busted more trusts than Roosevelt. He empowered the federal government to tax income. He built the Supreme Court building. He modernized the American judiciary. He did all this while his body was screaming, while his heart was failing, while his best friend was betraying him. He was a titan who accomplished more in his sleep, literally, than most men accomplish in a lifetime of wakefulness. But the tragedy remains. We mourn him not because he failed, but because he never truly owned his own life. He is the patron saint of the good son. He is the cautionary tale for every person who has ever swallowed their own dreams to make someone else happy. He is the mirror reflecting the terrifying cost of compliance. It is time to banish the image of the man in the bathtub. Instead, picture a different image. Picture him on the bench of the Supreme Court in the quiet twilight of the 1920s. He is old, he is scarred, but he is calm. The gavel is in his hand. The chaos of the White House is a distant memory. The screaming of the crowds has faded. He looks down at the law, the one thing that never lied to him, the one thing that never demanded he be anything other than what he was. In that silence, he is not heavy. He is weightless. The story of William Howard Taft is not a joke. It is a question that echoes from his grave to our lives today. When the world demands you be a king, Do you have the courage to remain just a man?